It was a regular evening, just like any other, and Sarah was driving home after a long day at her second job. The day had been tiring, but the thought of coming home to her children always brought a smile to her face. She was a single mother, working hard to provide for her kids, always hoping that the next day would bring them closer to a better life. As she turned down a familiar street in her neighborhood, the sound of sirens cut through the quiet night. Startled, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw flashing blue and red lights. Her heart skipped a beat. Not again, she thought to herself. She had seen this before, routine stops that felt more like harassment than necessary police checks. With a sigh, Sarah pulled over, trying to remain calm. She knew that remaining composed was key, especially with the officers she had encountered before. The car came to a halt, and she lowered the window as instructed. The officer who approached her looked like he had been out on the job for a while. His face was stern, and his eyes didn't meet hers as he asked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Sarah, always polite, replied that she wasn't sure but that she was ready to cooperate. The officer didn't answer immediately, just stared at her for a moment. There was a long pause, one that made her feel uneasy. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded abruptly. Sarah's pulse quickened. She was used to being stopped for minor infractions, but this was different. There was a tone in his VO. The days following the new wave of attention brought a mixture of emotions for Sarah. As much as she wanted to feel relief, the weight of the ongoing battle kept her grounded in reality. The police department had finally placed the officers involved on administrative leave, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the pressure had only just begun to mount. Every morning, as she prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't help but Sarah stood at the edge of something much bigger than herself now. The fight she had started for justice had taken on a life of its own, and it wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the community, the people who had suffered in silence for far too long. The officers had apologized, but that was only the beginning. They had to face the consequences of their actions, and the world was watching. The days after the meeting were filled with preparation. Sarah's lawyer, the civil rights organizations, and the growing movement behind her worked tirelessly to make sure the case would be heard fairly. As the media attention continued to escalate, the pressure on the police department grew. There were protests, marches, and community forums where people spoke out about the systemic racism in the police force, about how so many had been hurt, how so many had been silenced. The momentum was building, and Sarah felt it with every step she took. But even with all the support, it was hard. The public eye was on her constantly. There were days when she felt like she couldn't escape it. Everywhere she went, people knew her story. Some offered words of encouragement, others gave her looks of pity. It was hard to know who truly understood what she was going through and who was just caught up in the story. But there was one constant in her life: her children. Her kids were her reason for pushing forward. They were why she woke up every day, why she kept fighting. She didn't want them to grow up in a world where people like them were treated unfairly. She wanted to change the system so they could walk through life with their heads held high, knowing they were respected and valued. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Sarah sat down with her children for dinner. Her daughter, a bright-eyed 10-year-old, looked up at her with curiosity. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the weight of the question. Sarah smiled gently, reaching across the table to take her daughter's hand. "We're going to be more than okay, sweetie," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to make sure that things change, not just for us, but for everyone." Her son, who was a few years older, looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed with concern. "Will the police hurt us again?" he asked, his eyes wide with the fear he didn't know how to hide. Sarah's heart ached. She had never wanted them to feel this kind of fear, but she couldn't deny that it was real. "I won't let anyone hurt you," she said firmly. I promise, we're going to stand up for what's right, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." That night, as she tucked her children into bed, Sarah took a moment to reflect. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every mother, every father, every child who had been impacted by this kind of injustice. She thought of the countless people who had suffered in silence, who had been afraid to speak up, afraid that their voices wouldn't be heard. Sarah knew that her voice was powerful, but it was even more powerful when it was joined by others. Weeks passed, and the case continued to unfold. The officers were brought in for questioning, and evidence from the investigation was presented. The video footage, the witness statements, and the public outcry all painted a clear picture of the brutality Sarah had endured. The officers had tried to justify their actions, but it was impossible to deny the truth. The public knew it. The law knew it. And most importantly, Sarah knew it. The courtroom was filled with anticipation on the day of the trial. Sarah sat in the front row, her lawyer by her side, as the prosecutor laid out the case. She couldn't look away from the officers, who sat across the room, their faces grim. The older officer, who had been the first to speak to her that night, kept his head down, while the younger officer appeared restless, his hands trembling as he sat motionless. Sarah had hoped that by this point they would show true remorse, but the coldness in their eyes made it clear that their apology had been nothing more than an attempt to avoid facing the full consequences of their actions. The defense attorney tried to discredit Sarah's testimony, questioning her credibility, but the evidence was overwhelming. It was clear that these officers had acted out of hatred, out of a sense of entitlement, and had left Sarah with not only physical scars but emotional ones that would take years to heal. As the trial continued, Sarah couldn't help but think of all the people who had supported her, the friends, the family, the strangers who had come together to demand change. She knew that this was more than just a court case. This was a battle for the future, for a world where people like her wouldn't have to fear for their safety just because of the color of their skin. The turning point came when one of the key witnesses, a bystander who had filmed the incident, took the stand. The witness spoke clearly about what they had seen that night: the officers' aggression, their cruelty, and the way they had laughed as Sarah's car burned. The witness's testimony was the nail in the coffin. There was no way to justify what had happened. No excuse that could be made. The verdict was delivered just a few days later. The officers were found guilty on all charges. They had taken everything from Sarah, but now, in the face of justice, they had to answer for it. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Sarah sat there, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't just the weight of the verdict that hit her, it was the knowledge that, for once, the system had worked. The officers had been held accountable. But the victory didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Sarah knew that this wasn't just her personal triumph, it was a step towards something greater. It was proof that when people came together, when they spoke out, change was possible. In the weeks that followed, Sarah became a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. She spoke at rallies, joined panels, and worked with advocacy groups to push for further police reforms. Her case became a symbol, not just for the fight for justice but for the fight for equality. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but she was ready for it. She had faced unimaginable pain, but she had come out stronger on the other side. As Sarah stood at the podium at a rally months later, she looked out at the crowd of people who had come to support the cause. They were standing there, united in their desire for change. She could see the faces of people who had been through the same struggles, people who had been ignored, marginalized, and hurt. But now, they were all together, demanding a world where justice wasn't a privilege, it was a right for everyone. Sarah raised her hand and spoke, her voice strong and clear: "We are here today because we believe in a future where no one is left behind. A future where justice is not just a word, it's a reality. And I'm not going to stop fighting until we get there." The crowd cheered, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the weight of her struggle lift just a little. She had made it this far, and she knew the fight was far from over. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't alone anymore. And together, they would make the world a better place. Feel the sting of what had happened to her. The memories of that night, the flames, the branding, the humiliation would haunt her for a long time. She had been marked, not just physically, but emotionally, and she wasn't sure when or if that mark would ever fade. But the thing that gave her hope was the support of the community. People had rallied behind her in ways she hadn't expected. The stories of injustice, the voices that had been silent for so long, were finally being heard. One afternoon, as Sarah sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through social media, she saw the familiar faces of protesters holding signs with her name on them. The hashtags calling for justice were everywhere. News outlets continued to cover the story, and it seemed like every time she turned on the TV, there was a report on her case. What had started as a personal tragedy was now a movement, and Sarah was at the center of it all. But the attention came with its own pressures. It wasn't easy being in the spotlight, and the media didn't always portray her in the way she wanted to be seen. Some reporters focused on the emotional aspects of the case, while others sensationalized the details for a bigger story. It frustrated her. She didn't want to be a symbol, she wanted to be a mother, a person who had been wronged and was simply asking for justice. Despite these frustrations, she pressed on. Her children were her anchor. Every evening, as they sat together for dinner, Sarah would try to put aside the stress of the day, sharing laughter and stories about their school day. She didn't want her kids to feel the weight of what was happening. They had been through enough, and she would protect them from the chaos as much as she could. But sometimes, they asked questions about why the police had done what they did, why people treated them differently. Sarah tried her best to answer, but how could she explain to her young children the world's unfairness? How could she make them understand the injustice that had been inflicted upon them, the hatred that existed, even in the places they thought they could trust? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let them grow up in fear. As the days passed, Sarah's lawyer worked tirelessly on the case, pushing for more transparency and demanding that the officers involved be held accountable. The officers had been placed on leave, but many people believed this was just a temporary move until the story died down. But Sarah wouldn't let it die down. She continued to speak out, to fight, and to show up for every meeting and protest. She knew that her strength came from the love and support of the community, but it also came from a deep, unwavering desire for change. Then, something unexpected happened. The two officers who had been involved in the incident reached out to her, through their attorneys. They wanted to meet. The request was a shock to everyone, especially Sarah. Why would they want to meet her? What could they possibly say that would make a difference? At first, Sarah was hesitant. Why should she give them the chance to speak to her? Why should she give them the platform to justify what they had done? But something inside her told her to hear them out. Maybe it was because she didn't want to live in a world of anger and hatred. Maybe it was because she wanted to know the truth, why they had done it, what had gone through their minds, if anything at all. With her lawyer present, Sarah agreed to meet the officers. The encounter was set up in a neutral location, a public space where both sides could speak without feeling threatened. As Sarah walked into the room, her heart was pounding. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would they apologize? Would they justify their actions? Or would they remain silent, unwilling to take responsibility for what they had done? The officers arrived shortly after her. The older officer looked older now, his face drawn and tired, as if the weight of the situation had already taken its toll on him. The younger officer, the one who had started the fire, seemed more guarded, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. Neither of them looked at Sarah directly. They kept their eyes to the floor, unsure of how to begin. Finally, It was the older officer who spoke first. His voice was low, almost apologetic. We never meant for it to go that far," he said, his words fumbling as if he were searching for something to say that could make sense of the unexplainable. "I don't know what happened. It was just a bad situation, and we let it escalate. I'm sorry." Sarah stared at him, trying to process his words. Was this genuine remorse, or was it just a defense mechanism to avoid the consequences of his actions? She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if they would ever understand the gravity of what they had done, but now that she was sitting in front of them, the answer wasn't clear. Could they ever truly comprehend the pain they had caused her? The younger officer spoke next, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I know I can't undo what happened. I don't know why I did what I did. I've been thinking about it every day since. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I am sorry." Sarah listened, but her emotions were conflicted. Part of her wanted to hear them say the words that would bring closure, but another part of her felt that words alone were not enough. They could say sorry all they wanted, but the scar on her face and the trauma of that night would remain. She wasn't sure how to respond. The apology felt too little, too late. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Sarah said finally, her voice steady, though her heart was heavy. "What you did, what you took from me can't be undone. But I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to hear your apology. But that's not enough. You need to make it right. You need to be held accountable for your actions, and the system that let you do this to me, to others, needs to change." The room fell silent for a moment as her words sank in. Sarah wasn't looking for vengeance, but she wasn't going to let them off the hook. Accountability was the only way forward, the only way she could start to heal. And she wasn't going to stop fighting until she got it. The officers, though clearly shaken, nodded in agreement. The younger officer looked at her, his face filled with regret. "We'll face whatever comes," he said quietly. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she realized that this fight wasn't just about her, it was about all of the people who had been silenced, ignored, and forgotten. She wasn't alone in this struggle. And no matter how hard it got, no matter how long it took, she would keep fighting. For herself, for her children, and for the community that had rallied behind her. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Sarah was ready for whatever came next. Ice that suggested something wasn't right. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, closing the door behind her. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, his voice sharp. "Just home," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear growing inside her. "I've had a long day at work." The officer's eyes narrowed as he glanced at her vehicle. "And what's in the trunk?" he asked suspiciously. As the fire continued to consume her car, Sarah stood frozen in disbelief. The Heath days after the fire felt like an endless blur. Sarah went through the motions of her daily life, caring for her children, working her jobs, and trying to hold everything together. But inside, she was a storm of emotions. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames her car, her only means of getting around, reduced to ashes. It felt like more than just a loss of property, it was as though they had stolen a piece of her spirit. But amidst the pain, a flicker of determination began to grow. Sarah was tired of being quiet, tired of accepting that this was the way things had always been. She knew the officers who did this were part of a larger system of injustice, but she was determined to do everything in her power to make sure they didn't get away with it. The first step was reaching out to people who could help. Sarah contacted her lawyer, a woman who had been advocating for justice in the community for years. She wasn't sure if the lawyer would take her case, given the uphill battle ahead, but she was desperate. She couldn't do this alone. To her surprise, the lawyer agreed to take on the case. She was moved by Sarah's courage and by the sheer injustice of what had happened. "We're going to fight this," the lawyer said firmly. You're not alone anymore. Together, they began to gather evidence. Sarah had recorded the entire incident on her phone. The video wasn't perfect, but it captured enough of the moment to show the officer's brutality. She had also reached out to the neighbors who lived nearby, hoping they had witnessed something. Some were too afraid to speak up, but others, moved by her story, came forward. It wasn't long before the case started to gain traction. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon, it was being shared nationwide. People were shocked, angry, even. Many couldn't believe that something like this could happen in their own communities. The story sparked outrage, and the demands for justice grew louder. Sarah was overwhelmed by the support. She had always known that things needed to change, but seeing so many people stand by her side was something she hadn't expected. She had spent so much of her life trying to stay invisible, trying to keep her head down to avoid trouble. Now, she was in the spotlight, and it felt like the world was watching. But the journey wasn't easy. The police department, in an attempt to protect its officers, tried to downplay the incident. They claimed that the officers had acted in self-defense, that Sarah had been difficult and uncooperative. They tried to discredit her, painting her as someone who had provoked the officers into acting out of line. It was the same old narrative they used whenever someone from their force crossed the line. Sarah was devastated, but she didn't back down. The support from the community kept her going. People who had faced similar abuse came forward with their own stories, showing a clear pattern of misconduct among the officers. There were protests, marches, and calls for change. Slowly, the pressure on the police department grew. In the midst of all this, Sarah had moments where doubt crept in. The fight was exhausting. There were days when she wanted to give up, to walk away and pretend it hadn't happened. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything that had been taken from her. She had to keep pushing, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated, every person who had been silenced. She was fighting for justice, for accountability, for a future where her children wouldn't have to face the same injustices she had. The turning point came when more evidence surfaced. A video from a witness who had been filming from a nearby building revealed even more details of the officer's actions. It showed the older officer throwing the match into her car, and the younger officer laughing as the fire spread. The video also showed the branding, a grotesque symbol burned into her face. This new evidence was undeniable. The officers couldn't claim that they were acting in self-defense anymore. It was clear that they had acted out of hatred and malice, and now the public was outraged. The pressure on the police department became too great to ignore, and finally, the officers were placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. Sarah's case was gaining momentum, but it wasn't just the officers who were being scrutinized. The entire system that had allowed such abuse to happen was under a microscope. People began to question how often this kind of behavior had gone unchecked, how many other victims there were who hadn't spoken up. As the investigation continued, Sarah found herself in the middle of a larger conversation about police reform. Her story became a symbol of the need for change, a call for accountability in law enforcement. The attention was both overwhelming and humbling. It was clear that things were shifting, that people were waking up to the reality of what had been happening for so long. But for Sarah, the most important thing was the future. The changes that were happening now wouldn't fix everything overnight, but they were a start. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that there could be a better world for her children. She would keep fighting until that world became a reality. The journey was far from over, but Sarah had found her strength. She had found her voice. And now, she wasn't going to let anyone silence her again. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every person who had ever felt powerless, for every person who had ever been victimized by those in positions of power. Her fight had become their fight. And together, they would make sure that their voices were heard. The days ahead would be difficult, but Sarah knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. She wasn't going to stop until those who had wronged her, and so many others, were held accountable. The fight was just beginning, but Sarah was ready for whatever came next. And this time, she wasn't alone. Tea from the flames was unbearable, and the smoke filled her lungs, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to run, to get away from the officers who had turned her world upside down, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only watch as her car, her lifeline, was slowly destroyed. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She couldn't show them that they had broken her. She was stronger than this, she told herself. She had to be. She had her children to take care of, a life to build. But how could she move on from this? How could she ever feel safe again, knowing that people in positions of power could treat her like this? The older officer spoke then, his voice cold and dismissive. "This is what happens when you don't know your place." His words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She felt like the world had suddenly tilted on its axis, leaving her standing in the wreckage of something that used to be normal. She had always known there was inequality, that people like her faced different challenges. But now, in this moment, it felt like the very system was built to destroy her. "You don't get to tell me what my place is," Sarah finally found her voice, though it shook. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the raw anger that had suddenly welled up inside her. She had endured so much in her life growing up in a community where people of her background were often treated as second-class citizens, watching her friends and family face unfair treatment, but this was something else entirely. The younger officer, who had started the fire, seemed to take pleasure in her distress. He watched her as she stood there, surrounded by the flames that had stolen everything she had worked for. He had no remorse, no understanding of the pain he was causing. It was just a game to him. "I don't need to explain myself to you," the younger officer sneered, tossing his cigarette aside. "Just remember this moment. Maybe it'll teach you a lesson." Sarah's mind raced. How could she let them do this to her? How could she let them take everything from her and walk away unscathed? The anger inside her built up even more, but there was nothing she could do. The fire was too intense, and the officers had the power. She was alone. The older officer, still watching her, gave a small chuckle. "Maybe you should be more careful next time," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He started walking back toward his patrol car, the younger officer following behind him. They didn't seem to care at all about the wreckage they had left behind. They had made their point, and now they were leaving. It felt like they were getting away with murder, and Sarah could do nothing but watch them drive off into the night. As the officers' tail lights disappeared around the corner, Sarah was left standing there, a woman broken by the cruelty of a world that had always looked at her through a lens of suspicion and disdain. She could hear the crackling of the fire in her ears, its sound almost deafening. But it wasn't just the sound of the fire that echoed in her mind. It was the officers' words, their indifference, their belief that they could control her life. For a long moment, she just stood there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was shaking now, not from the cold or the fire, but from the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that washed over her. How had things come to this? How had she gone from a woman doing her best to provide for her children to this standing in the ruins of her car, a victim of brutality? But then, something inside her shifted. She couldn't let this be the end of her story. She wouldn't let it be. This wasn't just about the car. It was about standing up, about fighting back against a system that had allowed people like those officers to get away with their actions. She had her children to think about. She couldn't allow them to grow up in a world where this was acceptable. She had to do something. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her face felt hot from the tears she hadn't realized she'd been shedding. The pain in her chest felt sharp, like a weight pressing down on her. But she couldn't let this break her. She wouldn't let them win. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone, and dialed the number for the local police station. Her hands were still shaking, but she gripped the phone tightly. She wasn't sure what to say at first, but then the words came to her. "I need to report an incident," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Two officers just destroyed my car, and they branded my face with a metal rod." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah's heart raced. Would anyone even believe her? Would anyone care? "I'm sending someone to your location," the dispatcher finally said. "Stay where you are." Sarah hung up the phone, feeling a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't the only one who had ever suffered at the hands of corrupt officers. She wasn't the only one fighting for justice. Her next steps were unclear, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end. This wasn't the final chapter of her story. She would make sure of it. She would not let those officers go unpunished. She would not let them keep their power over her. A few minutes later, a police car arrived at the scene. The officer who stepped out looked young, nervous, and unsure. His face seemed to register shock when he saw the charred remains of her car, but he didn't seem to understand the gravity of what had happened. Sarah walked up to him, trying to stay composed, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "Two officers," she said, pointing in the direction the patrol car had gone. "They did this. They set my car on fire. And they branded me. You need to arrest them." The officer looked at her for a long moment, and then his gaze shifted to the remains of the car. He didn't say anything at first, but then he pulled out his phone and began typing. Sarah's heart sank as she watched him, unsure if he was doing anything to help or if he was just making a report. "Do you know their names?" the officer asked finally. Sarah shook her head. "They were wearing uniforms," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I don't know who they are." The officer seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "I'll file a report," he said, "but I'll need more evidence. Do you have any witnesses?" Sarah thought of the bystanders who had seen everything, the ones who had watched but hadn't intervened. Her heart sank even further. No one had stepped in. She was alone. But she wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. "I'll find witnesses," she said, her voice resolute. "This isn't over." "Just my groceries," Sarah answered, pointing toward the back of the car. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, but she tried her best to stay calm. There was something in the officer's tone that made her feel as though he wasn't interested in helping her, he was looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. Without warning, a second officer approached from the passenger side. This one was younger, but his eyes also lacked any kindness. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his tone not much softer than his partner's. "I don't know," Sarah responded. "He just asked me to step out of the car. I'm just trying to get home." But the officer didn't seem interested in hearing her explanation. Instead, he muttered something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch. It wasn't until the younger officer opened her trunk that Sarah began to feel a twinge of fear. They began searching through her personal items, tossing things around carelessly. She felt exposed and vulnerable. "Is there a reason you're treating me like this?" she finally asked, her voice trembling now. She couldn't believe this was happening. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if her very presence was causing the officers to act with hostility. The older officer turned to her then, a sneer curling on his lips. "Just doing our job, ma'am," he said sarcastically. "You know how it is." As he said that, Sarah noticed something strange. There were no other cars around, and the street was eerily quiet. She was alone with two officers in a darkened part of the city. Her sense of unease deepened. There had been rumors about these particular officers, rumors of them targeting people who looked like her. But this was different. Something in the air felt wrong. The older officer motioned to the younger one. Without saying a word, the younger officer went to the back of her car, his movements brisk and purposeful. A moment later, there was a loud crackling sound. Sarah turned to see that the officer had taken out what looked like a canister of gasoline. "What are you doing?" Sarah's voice rose, a surge of panic rushing through her chest. "You can't do this." But the officer didn't respond. He simply began to douse her car with gasoline, the liquid splashing onto the windshield and dripping down onto the ground. Sarah's heart raced in her chest. "Please, stop. This is my car. I need it," she shouted, but the officers were unmoved. The older officer walked over to her, his eyes cold. "You're making this difficult," he said. "All we're doing is teaching you a lesson. You won't forget this." Sarah's mind raced. She was in shock, not understanding how this was happening. Her car, the one thing she depended on to get to work and take care of her family, was being destroyed before her eyes. "Please," she pleaded, feeling the tears begin to form. "I haven't done anything wrong. Just let me go." But the officers didn't listen. Instead, the younger officer struck a match and threw it onto her car. In an instant, flames leapt up, licking at the sides of the vehicle. The fire was intense, burning brightly in the darkness, and Sarah could hear the crackling of the flames as her car was consumed by the fire. "No," she screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the fire. Sarah stumbled back, unable to take her eyes off the destruction unfolding before her. She couldn't believe what was happening. How had things escalated so quickly? The heat from the fire was overwhelming, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. She turned away, covering her mouth, but the officers didn't seem to care. They stood there, watching the fire, their faces expressionless. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah whispered, as if hoping that somehow, her words might stop the madness. But they didn't. The younger officer smirked. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The older officer, still silent, nodded in agreement. Sarah felt a coldness seep into her bones. Her car, the one thing she had worked so hard to keep, was being destroyed before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The fire grew higher, and she could hear the crackling of the metal as it warped and buckled under the heat. But it wasn't just her car. It was a violation of her dignity, a brutal reminder of the way she was seen, not as a mother, not as a hard-working woman, but as someone to be punished for simply existing. The flames seemed to represent everything she had feared. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about power, control, and the deep, painful wounds of systemic racism that she had encountered too many times before. The fire raged on, and Sarah stood there, helpless, feeling as though the world was collapsing around her.